The 911 dispatcher expected another routine complaint, but the confidence in the caller's voice made this one stand out. "There's a woman trespassing at our lake property," the HOA president said sharply. "I want her removed immediately." What she didn't know, what would soon unravel her entire sense of authority, was that the calm woman standing on that dock didn't just know the law. She ran the state police. That morning had started peacefully. The lake was still, the air cool, and my wife stood quietly near the water, enjoying a rare moment without uniform or rank. She was off duty, dressed casually, reviewing notes on her phone while sipping coffee. To anyone watching, she looked like just another resident enjoying the view. Then came the footsteps. A woman marched down the gravel path with purpose, phone already in hand, sunglasses fixed firmly on her face. She didn't ask questions. She made statements. HOA violations. Unauthorized access. Immediate removal. Her tone wasn't curious or cautious, it was practiced, rehearsed, and certain. My wife listened calmly and explained that the property was privately owned and not part of the HOA's jurisdiction. The explanation was met with a dismissive laugh. The woman waved her hand and announced she had already called 911. She said the police would handle it. Neighbors began to gather. A few phones came out. Whispers rippled through the air. The HOA president straightened her posture, visibly pleased. She believed the system would do what it always had: back her up. My wife didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply waited. When the sirens grew louder, the HOA president smiled. The sound felt like victory approaching. Patrol cars pulled in, doors opened, and officers stepped out until recognition hit. One officer froze. Another lowered his radio. Their expressions shifted from authority to respect in seconds. The HOA president demanded action, pointing sharply. Instead, the officers looked to my wife. She identified herself quietly. No badge flash. No announcement. Just facts. The air changed instantly. Radios crackled. Postures straightened. The officers exchanged looks that said everything without words. This wasn't a trespassing call. This was a catastrophic misunderstanding. As the HOA president's confidence drained from her face, more vehicles approached, not local police, but state command units. The crowd fell silent. The power dynamic flipped without a single shout. That call, made so casually, had summoned something far bigger than she ever imagined. And this was only the beginning. The moment the first state command vehicle rolled in, the tone of the entire scene hardened. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones lowered slowly. Even the birds seemed quieter. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute, it was a situation under formal authority, and everyone felt it at once. The HOA president took a step back, confusion flickering across her face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had expected officers to escort my wife away, not stand straighter in her presence. She repeated her demand louder, insisting rules were being broken and authority ignored. No one responded. An officer approached my wife respectfully and confirmed her identity in a low voice. When she nodded, he stepped aside without question. That single action spoke volumes. The chain of command had been recognized, and it did not run through the HOA. The woman tried again, explaining bylaws, community standards, and her position. Her words spilled faster now, defensive instead of commanding. A state commander calmly asked for the incident number from the 911 call. Another officer began taking statements. Clipboards appeared. Radios clicked. This wasn't escalation. It was documentation. My wife finally spoke, her voice steady and controlled. She asked who authorized the call and on what legal grounds. The question hung in the air unanswered. The HOA president's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced around, searching for support that wasn't there. Neighbors watched as the illusion collapsed in real time. The authority she had relied on for years evaporated the moment it was tested against actual law. No one argued for her. No one stepped forward. The commander explained, clearly and without emotion, that misuse of emergency services is a serious matter. That calling law enforcement to intimidate or remove someone without cause carries consequences. That this incident would be reviewed formally. The HOA president's confidence crumbled. She tried to soften her tone, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But misunderstandings don't come with demands and smug smiles. As officers completed their reports, additional state units arrived not for force, but oversight. Each arrival drove the reality deeper. This situation was no longer under anyone's control except the system itself. My wife remained composed throughout. She didn't threaten. She didn't lecture. She let process do the work. That restraint changed everything. The HOA president stood silent now, clutching her phone like it could reverse time. The call she had made for control had stripped it away completely. And the consequences were just beginning to take shape. By that evening, the story had already traveled beyond the lake. Group chats lit up, screenshots circulated, and short video clips spread faster than explanations. The HOA president attempted to regain control by sending a carefully worded email, calling the incident a minor misunderstanding. But the phrase felt hollow to anyone who had watched authority collapse in real time. 2 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. People who had never attended before showed up early. Folding chairs filled the room. Some residents stood against the walls, arms crossed, expressions tight with anticipation. The HOA president sat at the front, papers aligned neatly, posture stiff, smile forced. She opened the meeting with procedural language, hoping structure could rebuild what had shattered. It didn't. The first homeowner asked why police were called without verification. The president deflected, citing safety concerns. Another resident asked why the property wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction. Murmurs spread. Phones discreetly recorded. Tension climbed. Then someone played a video. The footage wasn't dramatic, but it was devastating. It showed the demand for removal, the dismissive gestures, the moment sirens approached. It showed officers recognizing my wife. It showed the shift. The room fell silent. The president tried to interrupt, but voices rose. Questions stacked quickly. Why were HOA dues being used to threaten residents? Why were emergency services treated like enforcement tools? How many other incidents had gone unchallenged? Her answers tangled. Explanations contradicted earlier statements. The more she spoke, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't an isolated lapse. It was behavior enabled by lack of resistance. Then my wife stood. She hadn't planned to speak, but clarity demanded it. She introduced herself simply, without title or emphasis. She explained the difference between authority and power. Between governance and intimidation. Between rules and law. Her voice was calm, instructional, precise. That calm did more damage than anger ever could. People nodded. Some looked relieved. Others looked angry, not at her, but at themselves for staying silent so long. A motion was called for an independent review. Another for suspension of enforcement actions. Then came the vote of no confidence. The HOA president objected loudly, insisting she was being targeted unfairly. But the vote passed overwhelmingly. The gavel fell, not in control, but in defeat. When the meeting ended, people lingered, talking quietly, processing what had happened. Outside, the president avoided eye contact, slipping past neighbors who no longer stepped aside. She had wanted someone evicted. Instead, she had exposed everything. The silence after the meeting felt heavier than any argument that had come before it. The HOA president's resignation wasn't announced immediately, but everyone sensed it was inevitable. Authority, once cracked in public, doesn't quietly repair itself. It erodes. And erosion had begun. Within days, official letters arrived. Not dramatic notices, not threats, just formal requests. County offices asked for HOA records, financial statements, complaint logs, communications tied to enforcement actions. The kind of paperwork that doesn't accuse, but exposes. The former president tried to explain herself to neighbors, framing the investigation as routine. But routine doesn't involve state oversight. Routine doesn't follow misuse of emergency services. The truth was moving on its own now, untouched by spin. My wife reviewed the situation the same way she approached every case. No emotion. No satisfaction. Just facts. The incident at the lake had triggered a review, but what followed revealed a pattern. Repeated intimidation. Selective enforcement. Residents pressured into compliance through fear rather than law. Investigators noticed it immediately. Several homeowners were contacted privately. Stories poured out. Fines issued without explanation. Threats delivered casually. Warnings framed as favors. What people had endured quietly now sat on official record. The former president's tone shifted from defensive to desperate. She blamed stress. Claimed burnout. Insisted she only wanted order. But order without legitimacy is just control wearing a polite label. The HOA's legal counsel advised cooperation. Records were released. Emails examined. The idea that a homeowners association could command law enforcement authority dissolved under scrutiny. Jurisdiction, it turned out, matters. Neighbors watched the process unfold with cautious relief. No shouting. No spectacle. Just accountability moving step by step. It wasn't fast, but it was thorough. One afternoon, a resident stopped my wife on the walking path and thanked her quietly. Not for the investigation. Not for the meeting. But for how she'd handled the moment on the dock. Calm, measured, unmoved by ego. That restraint had given others permission to speak. By the end of the week, the HOA announced interim leadership and suspended enforcement actions pending review. The neighborhood breathed again. The woman who had stood so confidently with her phone that morning now avoided public spaces entirely. Her authority had vanished, replaced by scrutiny she couldn't deflect. She had tried to use the system to remove someone. Instead, the system examined her. And it wasn't finished yet. The weeks that followed felt different, not louder or chaotic, but steadier, like a structure finally resting on solid ground. Without constant warnings and surprise notices, neighbors began talking again. Conversations stretched longer. Smiles returned. People realized how much tension they'd been carrying without noticing. The interim HOA leadership moved carefully, aware that trust once broken requires patience to rebuild. Meetings were announced early. Agendas were shared. Questions were welcomed instead of shut down. For the first time in years, residents felt like participants rather than subjects. Stories continued to surface. A retired couple described paying fines they never understood. A young family admitted they'd considered moving just to escape the stress. Others shared how they'd learned to stay quiet, believing resistance would only bring more trouble. Hearing these accounts out loud shifted something fundamental. Fear lost its grip once it was named. My wife stayed in the background. She didn't guide discussions or offer opinions unless asked. This wasn't her case anymore. It belonged to the community. That distinction mattered. People weren't following her authority, they were discovering their own. The former president's absence became noticeable. Where she once dominated conversations, now there was only quiet. No one spoke badly about her. There was no need. The facts had already done the work. Distance replaced conflict, and that distance was enough. One evening, the interim board presented a revised charter. It clarified boundaries, defined enforcement limits, and established oversight procedures. It was practical, unremarkable, and exactly what had been missing before. The vote passed unanimously. Afterward, neighbors lingered in the parking lot, talking in small groups. No one rushed home. That alone said everything. At the lake, mornings returned to normal. My wife walked the dock again, coffee in hand, without tension in the air. The water reflected sky instead of conflict. Ordinary felt earned. The lesson settled quietly across the neighborhood. Authority that demands obedience breeds silence. Authority that explains itself builds cooperation. Once people understood the difference, they refused to go back. What began as a single phone call had awakened an entire community. Not through confrontation, but through clarity. And clarity, once found, is hard to lose. The neighborhood hadn't just survived a misuse of power. It had outgrown it. Time didn't erase the incident, but it reshaped it into something useful. Policies changed, but so did attitudes. The new HOA leadership scheduled training, invited legal advisors, and published monthly reports. Transparency became routine, not a reaction. Residents noticed the difference immediately. My wife was asked to speak privately with the interim board, not as a commander, but as someone who understood boundaries. She explained jurisdiction plainly, describing where HOA authority ends and where law begins. No lectures, no warnings. Just clarity. The room listened. Across the neighborhood, participation rose. Volunteers joined committees. People asked questions without fear. Complaints dropped sharply, replaced by conversations. When disagreements appeared, they were handled openly. Nothing felt urgent or threatening anymore. The former president tried, briefly, to re-enter the conversation. She sent a message apologizing for how things felt. The wording didn't land. Accountability requires ownership, not distance. The message was acknowledged politely and then set aside. Life moved on. Investigators concluded their review. Findings were released quietly. There were penalties, requirements, and mandatory education regarding emergency services misuse. No headlines. No spectacle. Just consequences appropriate to the conduct. The system had corrected itself. One evening, a neighbor stopped my wife near the dock and asked how she had stayed calm when challenged so publicly. My wife answered honestly. Control comes from preparation, not volume. When you know the rules, you don't need to prove anything. That answer traveled. People repeated it. It became a shorthand reminder whenever tensions rose. Preparation over posturing. Process over pressure. The lake hosted a small community event weeks later. Nothing formal. Just food, laughter, and kids running along the shore. The absence of fear was noticeable. People felt present again. Standing there, it was clear the incident had drawn a line the neighborhood would not cross again. Authority would be shared. Questions would be welcomed. And emergency services would never be treated like a shortcut to control. Later, the interim board implemented a simple practice: every enforcement decision required written justification and a public explanation. That requirement slowed impulsive action and rewarded careful thinking. Residents could see reasoning, timelines, and appeal paths clearly. Disagreements still happened, but they unfolded with respect. The board learned to pause before acting, to ask whether a rule served safety or convenience. That pause mattered. It reminded everyone that governance is stewardship, not theater. With each meeting, confidence grew. People trusted outcomes because they understood processes. And understanding replaced anxiety. Transparency turned neighbors into partners, reduced rumors, strengthened fairness, and made leadership accountable, predictable, and humane for all. These changes endured because they were practiced daily, measured openly, and reinforced by shared values. Trust followed, slowly, steadily, and then all at once. The apology arrived without ceremony, folded neatly in an unmarked envelope and slipped into our mailbox late one afternoon. No HOA seal. No legal language. Just a single page written carefully, as if handwriting could soften the weight of what had already happened. The former president wrote about pressure, about feeling overwhelmed, about believing control was the same as leadership. She said she never intended harm. She said fear had driven her decisions. At the bottom, she asked for understanding, not forgiveness, but something close to it. My wife read the letter once, then placed it in a drawer. Regret has a different sound when it comes after consequences. It may be honest, but it arrives too late to change outcomes. Accountability had already moved forward, untouched by emotion or intent. And that distinction mattered. Around the neighborhood, life continued to normalize. New routines replaced old anxieties. Residents greeted each other without scanning for enforcement notices. Kids rode bikes freely again. Small freedoms returned quietly, the kind you only notice once they're no longer restricted. The new HOA leadership continued its steady work. Reports were published. Decisions were explained. Mistakes were acknowledged openly. Trust rebuilt not through promises, but through consistency. Several neighbors asked my wife how she resisted the urge to respond emotionally that morning on the dock. She answered the same way each time. Emotion escalates conflict. Clarity resolves it. Years of command had taught her that reacting gives power away, while restraint keeps it grounded. That idea spread. Nearby communities reached out with questions. Not about the incident itself, but about boundaries. About where authority ends. About how to challenge overreach without creating chaos. My wife never named names. She spoke in principles, not stories. The former president faded from public view. Not pushed out, not shamed, just absent. Power that depends on fear doesn't survive in environments built on transparency. Without silence to feed on, it disappears. The letter remained unanswered. Not out of anger, but because closure doesn't always require response. Sometimes, acknowledgement exists simply in allowing the system to work as intended. The real change wasn't the investigation, or the meeting, or even the apology. It was the shift in understanding across the neighborhood. People learned that authority isn't proven by how loudly it's enforced, but by how carefully it's used. That lesson endured. The morning that began with a 911 call ended with something quieter and far more lasting. A shared recognition that power, when misunderstood, creates fear. And when understood, creates stability. Backhand index pointing right. Do you want me to continue to Chapter 8? Yes. Chapter 8: How one call changed more than one street. Exactly 460 words. What surprised us most was how far the impact traveled beyond our neighborhood. Word spread quietly, not through headlines, but through conversations. Other HOAs nearby began asking questions. Board members attended workshops. Legal advisors were invited to explain boundaries. No one wanted to repeat the same mistake. My wife noticed the shift during routine briefings at work. Similar stories surfaced: citizens using emergency services to assert control, assuming authority could be borrowed by dialing a number. The lake incident became an anonymous example, stripped of names, focused on lessons. It resonated because it was familiar. Back home, the neighborhood felt lighter. People no longer hesitated before speaking. Concerns were raised early, addressed calmly, resolved openly. Disagreements still happened, but they no longer carried fear. Transparency had replaced tension. One afternoon, a new resident stopped my wife near the mailbox. She said she'd moved from a community where HOAs ruled through threats. She thanked my wife for proving that calm resistance works. That knowing your rights matters. That authority can be questioned respectfully. That moment stayed with us. The former president was occasionally seen around town, polite but distant. Without the structure that had amplified her voice, she was just another resident. Time had flattened everything. No one gloated. No one revisited the drama. The lesson had already been learned. The HOA's revised charter became a model shared with neighboring communities. Clear language. Defined limits. Mandatory training on emergency service misuse. What had begun as damage control evolved into best practice. At the lake, life returned to its simplest form. Mornings were quiet. Evenings were social. Children learned to fish where adults once argued. The space felt reclaimed, not by force, but by understanding. My wife reflected once that the most powerful part of the incident wasn't revealing who she was, but choosing when to do it. Had she reacted immediately, the moment would have become a confrontation. By waiting, she let assumptions expose themselves. That patience made the difference. Power, we learned, isn't about proving who you are. It's about knowing when proof is unnecessary. When systems function properly, truth rises on its own. The 911 call had been meant to remove someone. Instead, it removed confusion, fear, and a dangerous misunderstanding of authority. And that change extended far beyond one dock, one meeting, or one neighborhood. It traveled wherever people learned that calm accountability is stronger than intimidation and that real power doesn't shout. It listens. Morning returned to the lake with a sense of completion that felt earned rather than accidental. Sunlight schemed the water, footsteps echoed softly on the dock, and conversations carried without tension. Ordinary had come back, and everyone could feel the difference. My wife stood at the edge of the pier, coffee warming her hands, not reviewing reports, not waiting for radios to crackle. She was simply present. That presence said more than rank ever could. The neighborhood had learned that authority, when used correctly, fades into the background, allowing life to move forward. The HOA functioned differently now. Decisions were documented, reasons explained, appeals welcomed. Enforcement was rare and measured. Residents volunteered, questioned, and participated without fear. Governance became stewardship, and stewardship invited trust. The former president never returned to leadership. She became a quiet reminder, referenced gently when boundaries were discussed. No bitterness followed her name. Lessons don't need anger to persist. They need memory and practice. People sometimes asked whether the outcome felt satisfying. The honest answer was no and yes. No, because satisfaction implies victory over someone. Yes, because stability replaced anxiety. Because children played freely again. Because neighbors waved without checking who might be watching. That single call to 911 revealed a truth many communities ignore: systems work when people respect limits. When someone tries to shortcut process with intimidation, the shortcut collapses under scrutiny. Calm accountability endures. The lake hosted a small gathering weeks later. Nothing formal. Just shared food, laughter, and a sunset. No speeches were needed. The absence of fear spoke loudly enough. Looking back, the most important moment wasn't when uniforms arrived or titles were revealed. It was the pause before any of that happened. The decision to wait, to let assumptions speak first, to respond with clarity instead of emotion. That choice shaped everything. Stories like this spread because they offer relief. They remind people that they are not powerless, that knowledge and patience matter, and that authority must answer to law, not ego. The morning that began with an attempted eviction ended with something quieter and stronger. Understanding replaced intimidation. Process replaced posturing. A community remembered what fairness feels like. And the lake stayed peaceful, not because someone demanded it, but because everyone understood why it mattered. That understanding continues each day through small choices: asking questions, sharing reasons, slowing decisions, inviting appeal. It shows up in meetings run on time, notices written plainly, and leaders willing to say no to themselves. These habits seem simple, yet they protect neighbors from fear. They remind everyone that rules serve people, and people, together, keep places livable. Over time, trust compounds, conflicts cool, and communities grow resilient, guided by patience, fairness, and the shared belief that calm process beats force every single time.